Folks, it's that time of the year. Futurama's latest season has just wrapped up, and we as Futurama fans are here to litigate its very existence. Aren't we great? The latest 10 episodes delivered a real variety of stories this year, with almost every character getting the primary focus in at least one episode, with some old-school Star Trek-inspired episodes, some loose parodies, and far fewer overtly topical episode premises than the last season. There is a lot to run down. This video is a compilation of the 10 episode breakdowns I did over the course of the latest season, 7 of which were previously only released on my Patreon, and then at the very end there is a solid 5 to 6 minutes of wrap-up giving you my general thoughts about the season at large, season 9 or 12 depending on if you're a production order hombre or a broadcast bitch, and answering the important question: through 20 episodes on Hulu, has Futurama justified its revival yet? So enjoy nearly 2 hours of breakdowns on Futurama's second Hulu revival season.
Subscribe.
Futurama is back for its second revival season on Hulu. After dropping 10 episodes last summer, we're getting another 10 this summer, and if you didn't hear, an additional 20 episodes in the 2 years following this year. Futurama is fully back, baby. And while the first return season had some highs and lows, it did have a couple truly excellent episodes and ended on a massive high note. And despite another foray into a topical subject that already feels dated, this season premiere delivered a pretty classic existential Bender story, one that I really enjoyed. So let's dive into Futurama's take on Bender's cultural heritage and also NFTs. Alright, so right off the bat, I was pretty concerned for this episode. The opening scene lambasting NFTs was sort of a symptom of the exact thing I didn't love last season: overly topical story ideas that already feel dated. NFTs rose and fell so embarrassingly quickly that it feels like they've been out of the cultural consciousness for like 2 years already, which makes sense since that's about when they wrote these episodes. That being said, though the opening scene wasn't my favorite, the rest of the episode handled itself really well. Even the NFT-centric subplot was mostly fun, since the core of that story was the crew's NFT heist, and not really the NFTs themselves. And there were things I appreciated about the NFT explanation scene itself, even if I found the coverage of NFTs in general to be super dated and a little cringy. For one, I love that all of the kids are just sort of a kid gang now. Hubert, Dwight, and Kif and Amy's kids were all slowly added to the cast over the course of the entire series, and I like that they all just hang out now. They're a gang. Honestly, it's feeling like we're getting more of Axel, Mandy, and Newt than of Kif these days. I also enjoyed conceptually that the kids were the ones explaining NFTs to the adults, even if the incorporation of the NFTs at all was, as I mentioned before, a little cringy.
NFT stands for non-fungible token. That means it's unique.
So, while I wasn't a huge fan of this first sequence, I actually think the place they go with it is really great. While there's the obvious Bored Ape parallel with the apathetic fish company or whatever, the idea of turning Bender into a bunch of copy and paste NFTs with all of his personas from over the course of the series is very funny. I'm just grateful this isn't something they actually wanted to do and it's just a bit in the show. And Bender wanting to be featured as an NFT is so very Bender. He is so desperate to be adored and remembered. It's one of his most vital character traits. Being immortalized as a series of NFTs is absolutely something he'd want for himself. The very end of the episode showcases all of the Bender NFTs, and it is just jam-packed with references to countless old episodes, which I will run down probably at the end of this video because there are so many it would totally disrupt the flow of the breakdown. But I really like this setup. It allows for some fun references to old episodes, and it ties into vintage Bender behavior. Honestly, a very natural way to implement the whole NFT idea. And the whole realization that NFTs are effectively nothing, sending Bender spiraling, is a very funny way to trigger that classic Bender existential crisis.
I don't know who or what I am anymore.
God, Bender crying is just always funny. Bender's existential crises are a fundamentally important recurring theme in Futurama. We didn't see much of it in the last season on Hulu, and honestly, the last episode to really go for one of these stories was a bit underwhelming in Free Will Hunting, but Bender's adventure back to his native Mexico to meet his family really worked for me in this one. Even though when he got there, he ignored a turtle trapped on its back, the Bender from Crimes of the Heart would never. But Bender reconnecting with his Mexican roots is really fun. I always appreciated that what was clearly a throwaway joke in season 3 became such a core part of his character.
I'm Mexican, and I find that offensive.
And then this joke expanded just 3 episodes later with the reveal that his last name is Rodriguez. I just think that's so funny. A quick Hecho in Mexico joke became vital to the character's history and backstory. Speaking of, Bender meeting his family back in Mexico is probably my favorite aspect of this episode, even going so far as to ensuring that the lineage still lines up with previous lore, since we know that Bender's mother is an armbot, and we see that his grandmother Abuelatron is as well. Danny Trejo plays Bender's cousin Doblando Rodriguez. Doblar is the Spanish verb that means to fold, and it's used synonymously with bend.
Yep, it's shiny and metal, all right. And what of your ass? También es magnífico.
I love that the color of Doblando's metal is a bit warmer, like it's been sun-worn from living in the Mexican sun. That's just a really cool little detail. And we get to see a ton of Bender's extended family as well, including his adorable little niece. This whole thing had me thinking about Bender's family tree, so I'm actually going to be dropping an entire video breaking that down this week, so keep an eye out. But everything in Bender's ancestral home is very funny to me. Even just on its face, the idea of robots living in this incredibly old-timey setting just makes for some great visuals. Lightning-quick knitting, creating Ethernet cable from electric sheep with a spinning wheel, ancient pottery, just the novelty of advanced machine intelligence beating a rug with a rug beater does not wear on me. I think my favorite scene in the episodes, though, were Bender connecting with his Abuelatron.
You know, Bendejo, I used to love cooking with your mother.
Could you tell me about her?
These scenes are sweeter than they have any right to be, especially since they're mostly talking about a robotic arm here. This episode was written by Eric Horsted, who is a bit of an expert when it comes to fleshing out Bender's history. He wrote The Lesser of Two Evils, which introduced fellow bending unit Flexo, Benless Love, which showcased Bender getting built for the first time by his robotic arm mother, and then also Lethal Inspection, which slightly retconned Bender's assembly, showcasing that he was initially built as a baby bending unit instead, which, in my opinion, is much better. That's an example of a quality retcon. He also did The Bots and the Bees, which introduced Bender's son, Ben. I guess the one aspect of Bender's ancestral home that I wasn't wowed by was the whole hoop aspect, the ancient sport played by the entire village. But that's seemingly because hoop isn't something they made up for the episode. It's an actual sport played by the ancient Mayans that did involve ritual sacrifice, so that might be why it stood out to me. Some of the sequences during the hoop tournament were really fun. This is probably the best a 3D model of Bender has ever looked. I mean, look at this thing, what a great shot. Though I'm not sure how much I love the idea that Bender's family tricked him into winning to be sacrificed by the ancient robot gods. He gets this really great celebratory moment with his family after he wins, and then it's revealed that they basically set him up to be sacrificed. Kind of a bummer. This gag where Bender puts these skeleton arms on one at a time while armless is a pretty fun callback to the pilot episode when he did that same thing with his regular arms, and I did enjoy Bender meeting the ancient robot gods. Really cool designs, and the idea that their programming is facilitated through these ancient bead necklaces that have been showcased through the episode is pretty cool.
That one does spreadsheets. That one solves the traveling salesman problem. And that one lets you play solitaire on your phone.
This is also one of those solid dorky science jokes Futurama is known for. The traveling salesman problem is basically a computer science exercise in optimization, determining the shortest possible route a traveling salesman can take while hitting every single city he needs to and returning to the point of origin. I am, of course, not a computer scientist, and I'm sure many of you could explain this concept more thoroughly in the comments, but as a scientific layman and fan of Futurama, I love when the show brings these concepts up. It's a fun way to learn, for me at least. I also laughed incredibly hard at this Bender delivery when the ancient bots explain how to steal an NFT off the blockchain.
You'd have to be able to factor huge integers in polynomial time.
I know, a little kid told me.
Now, the subplot of this episode was the continued NFT storyline, and even though NFTs are so dated already, this story was in the form of a heist, and I had a ton of fun with it. It's hard to be mad that they're heisting NFTs when the heist itself is so much fun.
You're on, Zoidberg. Uh-oh, I can't snip it.
Overall, my only real misgiving about this episode is how hilariously dated NFTs already are as a plot point, and some of the scenes where they're sort of exhaustingly going over the details of how NFTs do or don't work is a bit much. But I found the way it was haphazardly tied into Bender's familial lesson to be pretty funny. Bender expresses how meeting his family reminds him of all of the great facets of himself.
Sounds like your family's a lot like your NFT.
Yeah, that's why I want it back. to remind me of my people or whatever.
It's pretty classic Bender to go on a whole self-reflective journey to meet his ancestors and end with the takeaway that Bender is great. But honestly, I was most impressed that they managed to make something so profoundly stupid as NFTs actually hold emotional weight for Bender as a character.
I now own the factors of a million-digit binary number that no one else can ever have.
One of the funniest aspects of Bender as a character is that he is so desperate to be unique, remembered, special, despite the fact that he is a mass-produced bending unit. So the idea that he has this wholly unique piece of data that, while completely meaningless, is 100% his own, actually does make a ton of sense for the character. It's pretty damn creative. Far more creative than any single NFT, that's for sure. Plus they get this one last excellent jab in.
Why would a human want an NFT if it's just some huge string of numbers?
No conceivable reason.
So even though it feels a couple years late, it's hard for me to hate this dunk. It's a very funny line. Honestly, when the episode started, I was pretty instantly worried about this new season. Dropping a big NFT sequence immediately was definitely a concerning way to start the year, but overall the episode really worked for me. I think they used the NFTs as a plot device a bit better than they did with the Bitcoin episode last season. I felt the concept was used in a pretty natural way to explore Bender as a character, and the heist was a pretty good time. While there is a ton of NFT-based gobbledygook, I think the integration of the idea into the episode outside of that was pretty natural and effective. It is interesting. I think that the episode does a really good job just fully dunking on the concept of NFTs, but I also think people are just sort of so exhausted by the brief amount of time that NFTs were a thing that even the mere mention of them feels in itself exhausting. Even though there are some certifiably funny dunks in the episode, I think people will just feel negatively about any references to NFTs at all. The stuff surrounding the NFTs was definitely what worked best for me. Probably the best Bender existential crisis we've gotten since like the early 2010s. I also want to say off the bat, just like last year, I actually got to watch the first 6 episodes of the season early, so I'm really happy to tell you that the whole NFT thing is by far the most topical the episodes have gotten this far. There are a couple subplots here and there that make dated references, but for the most part, anything that is remotely referential still feels very Futurama on the whole. They're doing a much better job this season making it feel like they took topical ideas as a starting point and then built a more Futurama type plot out of it, rather than slapping a Futurama skin on a modern subject like the Hulu or COVID episodes last year. I'm really excited for you all to see next week's episode, and I'm very excited to talk about it. It's probably my favorite in the run so far. It's a follow-up to the classic Fry flashback episodes that are mostly so highly regarded. Okay, and now, before we go, let's run down every single reference from across Futurama in Bender's NFTs in order. We've got Firefighter Bender from the Inhuman Torch, Super King from Less Than Hero, Wireframe Bender as seen in Lethal Inspection, Gold Bender from the Farnsworth Parabox, Bender the Magnificent from Jurassic Bark, Night Bender from Bender's Game, Fedora Bender from Stench and Stenchability, Pharaoh Bender from A Pharaoh to Remember, Gender Bender from Raging Bender, Bender in his Blips or Cruds uniform from Assy Come Home, Bender disguised as a woman trying to get into the Olympics in Bend Her, Sombrero Bender as seen in this episode and also Lethal Inspection, Hillbilly Bender from Where the Buggalo Roam, Regular Old Bender, Napoleon Bender, which is slightly color palette swapped from Decision 3012, Satanic Ritual Bender from Calculon 2.0, Camping Bender from Spanish Fry, Hard Hat Bender seen in Into the Wild Green Yonder, though the hat was white in that, and it's yellow here, Fur Coat Bender from Raging Bender, Pirate Bender from the Deep South, Cowboy Bender from the Parallel Universe in I Dated a Robot. Bender also actually stole this same hat in Leela and the Jeanstalk, Monk Bender from Free Will Hunting, Soldier Bender from the reenactment in Lethal Inspection, Nonchalanto from The Prisoner of Benda, Mob Bender from Silence of the Clamps, and British Bender from All the President's Heads. If y'all recognize any of the ones I skipped from old episodes, let me know. There was a few that I just couldn't figure out.
See ya, fossils!
Futurama's latest season just dropped its second episode, delivering our first emotional Fry family flashback since 2013. But Quids Game had a lot to live up to, following up 4 fan-favorite episodes: Luck of the Fryrish, Jurassic Bark, Cold Warriors, and Game of Tones. So, did this episode land the emotional gut punch the same way its predecessors did? Does the fact that it's a Squid Game parody distract from the story? Will we ever learn Fry's mom's name?
Find out in today's Futurama episode breakdown. Stone.
All right, so right off the bat, I'm going to say I never saw Squid Game. And though it's clear that the entire premise of this episode is a parody of it, it does not seem like it's particularly one-to-one, mostly just taking the idea and Futurama-izing it, which is exactly how they should be drawing inspiration from other media and even topical ideas, in my opinion. What's great about Quids Game is that it absolutely does not rely on any pre-existing knowledge of Squid Game for it to play well as a Futurama story. It sets up all the context needed for the 40-person competitive games, whether you've seen Squid Game or not. I think this is the show using more recent media and its storytelling the right way. I also love that for this, and for the previous flashback episode Game of Tones, they find a cool sci-fi reason for Fry's memories to be revisited. In Game of Tones, they had to recover a memory from Fry and went into his dreams to revisit those memories. In this one, it's Fry's birthday, and since he's the first to fall into this weird planetary object, that object adapts his memories and recreates the events of his 8th birthday.
The theme was Game Night Afternoon.
Honestly, this whole premise feels very Star Trek, and I really love it for that. They go to a planet, and a weird thing happens to them. Actually, this might be because this premise is super similar to Where No Fan Has Gone Before, where the Star Trek cast and Planet Express crew are held hostage by an alien until they do a series of tasks and games. Really similar, actually. One of the really fun aspects of Quids Game is just how many characters they jam into it, though. Needing 40 contestants, it's just such a fun mishmash of characters from the show's history. And the initial joke that they're all invited to Fry's surprise birthday party is the brand of silly that I really like from Futurama.
Happy B-Day, Fry.
I particularly love that the fortune-telling robot is there for some reason. Also, Randy, who we know from Overclockwise is Fry's next best friend after Bender and Leela. For this flashback episode, the Quids Game events in the future are based on the games that Fry played at his 8th birthday party with his friends. This is actually the earliest flashback we've gotten in any of these episodes, where Jurassic and Game of Tones were leading up to when he was frozen, and both Fryrish and Cold Warriors were when he was around 13 to 14 years old. This seems like a good place to talk more about the previous flashback stories and how this one stands apart from those. Like I said in the introduction, this episode had a lot to live up to, being the 5th episode in the series of Fry family flashback episodes. The first, Luck of the Fryrish, is still considered by countless fans to be the best episode the show has ever made, and that is hard to argue with. I think it's currently my 2nd favorite episode of all time. It's an absolute masterpiece, focusing on Fry's strained relationship with his brother. And as if that weren't enough, the next episode in the series is Jurassic Bark, without a doubt the most infamous episode in all of Futurama, focusing on Fry's relationship with his dog Seymour. These 2 episodes were 2 of the most popular in the original Fox era, and then they even managed to deliver a couple more quite well-regarded flashback episodes in the Comedy Central era, Cold Warriors and Game of Tones, which focus on Fry's relationship with his father and mother respectively. I actually did a video years ago sort of laying out the timeline of Fry's pre-future life, if that interests you. The way these episodes are structured is that they typically go out of their way to end with a flashback that recontextualizes parts of the episode we just saw and deliver a huge emotional gut punch. In Luck of the Fryrish, Fry thinks his brother stole his identity, when in reality it was his nephew who was named after Fry after he disappeared. In Jurassic Bark, Fry decides not to resurrect his dog because he learns he lived a very long life, only to reveal that the dog's long life was spent eternally waiting for Fry to return. Cold Warriors delivers an episode where it seems like Fry's got a bad relationship with his father, only for the final flashback to reveal that Fry knows his dad is hard on him because he wants him to be resilient, and that Yancey Sr. fully believes that Fry will pull through and make him proud. Game of Tones is a bit of an outlier because it's more about Fry lamenting the time he lost with his mother, only for him to get the opportunity to actually speak with her in her dreams. Less of a recontextualization, but an incredible emotional gut punch nonetheless. So if you're a fan of this show and know these episodes well, you sort of know the beats that Quids Game is expected to hit. It's going to parallel a story set in the future with one of Fry's memories from the past. This obviously focuses on his 8th birthday, which he seems to have a lot of traumatic memories attached to, and I like this setup because as we watch the flashbacks unfold, it seems like the birthday party is going about as well as Fry could have hoped. One major addition to the lore this episode makes is the reveal of Fry's prior relationship to Josh Gedgie. This character was introduced in Cold Warriors as Fry's bitter rival for the Nerd Search 88 Science Fair, but this episode's recontextualization reveals that they were actually best friends until the events of his 8th birthday. While this clearly wasn't the intention when Gedgie was introduced, I actually quite like this revelation. I think it fits pretty nicely into into the sort of tragedy of the Fry family timeline, and it also leaves any viewers who are super familiar with these episodes with a hint that something is going to go wrong, alongside Fry's generally woeful recollections of the birthday party. And the escalated versions of all the party games from his 8th birthday are pretty fun to watch, even if the characters are under the impression that all of their friends and loved ones are dying as they're playing. But the barrel of monkeys turning into an actual human hanging chain over acid, and I generally just enjoyed all of the games being adjusted to be to the death! While I do think the episode mostly stuck the landing, there is one aspect that feels a bit ham-fisted to me. The entire crux of the conflict revolves around Fry's traumatic memories of being accused of being a cheater at his birthday party, since he somehow won every single game. And I think this is a fine idea, and the way it comes back around in the recontextualizing flashback works really well for me. But I think the execution of Fry's trauma surrounding it is a bit clunky.
I can't do that, Leela. I am not a cheater. I'm not.
Look, I think it's a good idea to have Fry be reflecting on this sad memory, but I really think they lay the whole cheater thing on a bit thick.
I've never cheated in my life. Never. But I'll do it. This once.
Obviously, this is partially because this was just never something that has been established about Fry, but I don't think the episode needed it to be spelled out that explicitly. It almost felt like they didn't quite trust the audience to get the correlation between his memories. The way Fry keeps whining about being seen as a cheater feels very unnatural and kind of juvenile.
All I ever wanted was for people to believe I'm not a cheater.
Fry, you're like 50 years old now. That's all you ever wanted? But despite this one aspect of the story feeling a little clumsy, I do think the idea behind it is what makes the episode really work. Fry has this traumatic memory where he did absolutely nothing wrong, and yet none of his friends believe him, leading to the loss of his best friend.
I hope you had fun cheating, because nobody else did.
Every single person at his party leaves angrily, and 8-year-old Fry is left all alone on what is supposed to be his special day. At that age, that would be a horribly depressing and traumatic event, and I really like that at the end of his birthday in the future, it ends with literally every single party guest embracing him.
Group hug! Come on, group hug!
I think this sentiment really understands the sort of underlying hope behind Fry as a character. Though we are seeing this super sad and traumatic event from his past, one of the many that are a part of who he has become, it acknowledges that Fry's life was always supposed to take place in the future. Where he struggled to fit in and find purpose in his life in the 20th century, he has always fit in the future, and the people there embrace him. And this whole idea also led to what had to be one of my biggest laughs in the entire Hulu run of Futurama, as Fry fears he might lose Bender the same way he lost Gedgie.
I lost a best friend a long time ago because he thought I was cheating, and I'm not gonna let it happen again.
I don't want to lose you either, Fry.
Oh God, Hattie McDougal is just one of the greatest side characters in Futurama history. Okay, so let's talk about that final beat now. The all-important emotional gut punch that these flashback episodes sort of hinge on. The reveal is essentially that though Fry did not cheat himself, his mother tipped the scales in his favor in every single gaming event that they played.
He's my son, and I love him. And I want to give him a birthday that'll leave him feeling like a winner for once.
And so, essentially, this thing that Fry's mother attempted to do to make him feel better about himself was actually the exact thing that made his 8th birthday the worst, most traumatic birthday he's ever had. Because of his mother's actions, he lost his best friend and seemingly the rest of his friends as well. Even this kid who just looks so sick. And I think this is a pretty affecting ending. It's really messed up. And if you're going to compare it to any of the other endings of these flashback episodes, I think the closest analog is Jurassic Bark, though obviously it isn't quite that depressing. But here's the distinction. Episodes like Luck of the Fryrish actually show Fry learning that recontextualization alongside the audience. The moment we realize how much Fry's brother misses him, Fry does as well. In Cold Warriors, the audience is learning something that Fry actually already knew the entire time, so it changes our perception of what Fry was going through the entire episode. Game of Tones, the audience and Fry learn simultaneously that he would actually get this opportunity to say goodbye to his mother, and that she would actually remember it. It changes the context of Fry's disappearance in relation to Mrs. Fry. But with Jurassic Bark and now Quids Game, the audience is learning new context that Fry never learns. In Jurassic Park, we just have to watch poor Seymour tragically wait years for Fry, even though Fry thinks Seymour forgot about him and lived a whole life without him. And in Quids Game, we learn why Fry's friends thought he was cheating and abandoned him, while it fully remains this depressing mystery from Fry's point of view. We know the lengths that Fry's parents went for him because they cared about him, but he never actually learns that himself. Both Jurassic Park and Quids Game are like this double whammy of depression. Oh, you're not going to get your dog back, and also he waited for you for 10 years and never forgot about you, but you'll never know that. And oh, you lost all of your best friends at this horrible birthday party, and you never learned that it was just because your parents really love you. Kinda brutal, man. I do think Quids Game's ending feels different than every other one of these flashback episodes, even though Jurassic Park is definitely the closest analog. Obviously, Jurassic is just a heart-wrenchingly depressing final sequence, but this is more of a, oh my god, that is so messed up, bro. I wasn't sure how I felt about it the first time I saw it, but it settled in well for me. I think this episode fits really nicely in with the other 4 in the Fry family flashback canon. It's a nice addition. I will say, this is the second of these flashback episodes in a row that sort of puts a microscope on Fry's mother, and yet she is the only member of his family who has not been officially named in the text of the series, and I kinda hate that. Even the dog has a name. Come on, guys. This episode was written by Cody Ziegler, and based on this and the episode he wrote last year, it seems clear that he really likes writing for the extended Futurama cast of characters. Rage Against the Vaccine jammed in tons of characters from the show's history. I am not a big fan of his previous episode, but I really enjoyed Quids Game. I think he managed to fit all of those characters into the story much more naturally this time. Honestly, this is probably my 3rd favorite episode of the Hulu run behind I Know What You Did Next Xmas and All the Way Down, so I think he really nailed it this time. I hope people don't complain about this episode being topical because of the Squids Game parody aspect. To me, that complaint would frankly be misunderstanding the issue with episodes that are too topical. They did it right with this story. They took the seed of an idea from something that exists and built out a Futurama version. Parodying a popular piece of media is not being topical. Directly referencing modern day things without changing them in a substantial way, a way that will make stories eventually feel dated, that is the issue with topical stories. This is exactly why a lot of people didn't take well to the NFT subplot last week. Ironically, I also think this is why, though it's still not an episode I love, parts of Attack of the Killer app from the Comedy Central era aged better than others. While at the time doing an iPhone parody felt way too topical, the way they turned it into a future phone that literally fits in your eyeball actually has aged quite well. That's a cool future twist on the phone concept. But other topical jokes from that episode, like Susan Boyle, should perhaps have never made it out of the writer's room, or maybe never made it out of the brain of whoever thought of it. Overall, I think this is a super strong episode. I laid out the things that feel a little clunky to me, but it's still easily one of the best of the Hulu era so far. I'm not entirely sure where I think it ranks amongst the other 4 Fry family flashback eps, which vary from good to masterpiece, but I think the fact that it can stand among those pretty confidently is all I need.
Well, that was the 2nd worst birthday party I ever had.
This week's Futurama is called The Temp and delivered a fun little sci-fi mystery that felt fully inspired by Star Trek the original series or classic Twilight Zone. Just a self-contained, weird stuff is going on type adventure, and I personally really appreciated this kind of a more self-contained, straightforward story. Just a fun, old-school premise and a surprising amount to talk about. So let's do it. So like I said, this episode really reminds me of classic Star Trek TOS or Twilight Zone, which is fitting given that the writer is David A. Goodman. Goodman previously wrote Where No Fan Has Gone Before, which is the literal Star Trek episode of Futurama, and last season he wrote Related to Items You Viewed, which if you recall did have a pretty sci-fi resolution. Oh, and he also wrote like 5 episodes of Star Trek Enterprise, so good choice for a Star Trek inspired episode. But the Trek influence is very obvious from the opening score, clearly emulating Star Trek, and of course the Captain's log.
Captain's diary. Stardate. Lur and Unda's 63rd anniversary.
Another interesting note, likely to make the Trek influence clear, this is a rare episode with a cold open. Futurama used to do tons of cold opens back in the first season, which I think was a pretty good way to build the world with little one-off gags. But beyond that, it's very rare that they do cold opens at all, usually just to catch us up to date with important context, like the rift in space between Bender's Big Score and Beast with a Billion Backs, or when the show gets renewed on a new network and they have to solve the previous series finale, like in Rebirth or for the impossible stream, but this cold open just sets up this goofy-ass mystery in the best, most straightforward way possible, showing off this weird Fry replacement and the fact that nobody seems to know the difference.
You always know how to make me feel better, Fry.
That's what I'm here for, honey.
I love that music sting, it's perfect. I just think this is such a fun intro. I think if I had any complaints about the episode overall, it's that this first act is a little boring. I like the whole idea of Lur and Dindinda's vow renewal ceremony. It's fun on paper, and I do appreciate that their whole continued thing is they're always dealing with some hiccup or milestone or issue within their marriage.
And you look just as you did the night I met you on the hairy hills of Badunkdunk.
And I guess I do appreciate learning more Omicronian customs. I just didn't find much of this opening sequence all that compelling, outside of them establishing how much the Temp loves working at Planet Express, which, to be fair, I did find this very funny.
Oh, I'll never get tired of this job. I am the best life ever.
But once the episode flashes back and explains what's happening, it really picks up, revealing that his origin stems all the way back to the events following Amazon Women in the Mood, as Fry was recovering from his snoo injuries. I thought this was a pretty fun way to establish that this story spans 23 years, tying it to a previous story somewhat naturally. Plus, Fry's choice of vacation spot after his pelvis was crushed is extremely funny.
Enjoy Amazonia.
Part of me kind of wishes they had animated this sequence in the 4:3 aspect ratio and made it look a bit more like the show used to back in 2001. Sort of like how they did the opening flashback of the semi-recent Bleeding Gums Murphy episode of The Simpsons, but I know that's pretty extra. And I guess this flashback does span like a good 6 minutes, so maybe animating that much of the episode in a different aspect ratio would have been jarring. But I would have liked it. But man, I did really just enjoy this Temp character, even though it was really weird that they never gave him a name. I love the idea that this guy's life as a Temp is just so utterly boring and depressing that working at Planet Express is the most exciting thing that has ever happened to him.
Wait, seriously? Traveling? I've never been anywhere before.
I thought this was a pretty fun little montage. Nice to see some actual deliveries happening and even some fun callbacks like Zoidberg watching one of his uncle Harold Zoid's films. Okay, let's talk about this Liberry business real quick. This is a bit of a retcon, but I do think it's a funny one. In the same way that dialect has changed in the future so that ask has become axe, they've retconned library into Liberry, which again is very, very funny. But it is contradictory to what we've seen previously. In The Day the Earth Stood Stupid, Fry uses the word library.
The library!
But as you can see, it clearly says New York Public Library. And timeline-wise, Amazon Women in the Mood takes place a solid 6 episodes before The Day the Earth Stood Stupid. Honestly, the ask/axe thing was always a really funny world-building touch, and it does sort of feel like a missed opportunity to not have had a few more of these dialect changes, like the library retcon. We even see Ben Beeler as the librarian on the sign. Ask him anything.
Welcome to the library.
So while I do like this, obviously Futurama fans are the type to be a little upset about this continuity-wise, which is a little silly. I do wish they had maybe thought of the library thing 25 years ago, but what are you gonna do? And this joke is seemingly going to continue into the season's anthology episode later, the Futurama Mystery Library. That's actually the title coming up. But back to the main story. This flashback's final sequence has the crew trying to get rid of all of these water-damaged books from the library, leading to this fully classic Futurama joke.
It's been illegal to dump hazardous waste in the ocean for over a year now.
And of course, the fact that they forget the Temp at the Barnes and Nebula, since he is so forgettable. This poor man. They left him on this planet of moldy books for 23 years. And this is where the episode starts to feel more Twilight Zone than Star Trek to me. A horrible thing happens to this unsuspecting dude, and then he uses a mysterious supernatural hypnosis technique to take the place of Fry. Because to him, being a delivery boy for Planet Express is literally an ideal life. And this, of course, strands Fry and the Dalton B planet in his place.
Finally, a use for the Bible. Hey, wait! Why hast thou forsaken me?
The visual of the Temp using his weird hypnosis technique was a brand of silly that really worked for me. Just visually. The eyes twirling like that is just very funny. And I like how this episode just kind of has weird stuff happen that we're supposed to accept until it's explained later. It makes the episode structure a little bit all over the place, but I think it works well for the mystery being unveiled. This first act basically just plays it straight with the mystery Temp in Fry's place. Then the second act uses a flashback to reveal the Temp's backstory and show him take Fry's place without specifically revealing how he knows how to do that. And then this last act is the crew realizing something is wrong and getting to the bottom of everything. Leela wondering why she has absolutely no desire to stay in her apartment with quote-unquote Fry, why productivity is up, why body odor is down, etc. I did appreciate that when they finally went back to Dalton B to get Fry, who at this point they think is actually the Temp, it's Leela's connection to Fry that breaks the hypnosis. Though, I do have one small continuity complaint. Fry's beard should be darker orange, not the same color as his hair, at least based on Lars in Bender's Big Score. Come on, guys, get it together. But I think this episode as a whole works well. It's a mystery, but it's not like a mystery that the audience is supposed to figure out as it goes along. It's one that is slowly revealed over the course of the episode, which is what makes it feel more like classic Twilight Zone or Star Trek. I like the reveal that the hypnosis technique was from one of only 2 non-destroyed books that the Temp had access to, The Art of Clang Fu. This fits into the existing narrative pretty neatly, and I also really loved this Return of the King joke.
That one I didn't read. It's the 3rd book of the trilogy, and I've never read the first 2. I didn't want to spoil it, you know?
And I think most of all, I just really appreciated that the episode stayed so true to its main conflict the entire time. The fact that this dude is almost supernaturally forgettable. Even after they start this very complicated plan to try and restrain the Temp, the moment he is out of their sight, they literally completely forget he exists and leave him on the planet again. This is such a unique episode because it is super straightforward story-wise, but it is structured in a way that makes it more of a convoluted mystery. If we had just seen all of these events in order, there wouldn't be many questions, but I appreciated how simple the story was and that it was presented to us in a more fun way. The mystery revealed in the cold open is so immediately compelling, and I never really got tired of the idea that the Temp was this nice, really hardworking dude that could not have been more forgettable. Usually for me, a top-tier episode of Futurama has some manner of big ideas, whether that's related to the lore of the series or the sci-fi concept at play, and that pointedly is not what this episode was, but I still really appreciated the Temp's brand of mystery. It was clearly inspired by classic episodic mysteries like Star Trek or Twilight Zone, but it wasn't overly reliant on them as a reference point. It used Futurama's history in a decently fun way, and maybe most importantly, I laughed a lot. Even though the episode wasn't one that blew me away, I have so few complaints about it as a whole. Just a solidly fun episode. I guess my biggest complaint is I just wish they had given this poor man a name.
Frank. His name was Frank.
Futurama's 4th episode of their newest season, Beauty and the Bug, just released and takes Bender on a Running of the Bulls-inspired romp across Mars. This one added to the ever-growing lineup of Bender love interests, added some new creature lore to the Bugalows wiki page, and also introduced us to some new areas of future Mars, so let's just get into it.
Trademark infringement? My specialty!
Interestingly, this is the 2nd Bender-focused episode this season within the first 4 episodes, with the first embedding him in Mexican culture, while this one is now planting him firmly in Spanish culture. I just thought that was kind of funny that they did 2 different Spanish-speaking countries for Bender, even though this one did not actually take place in Spain. I do think that on paper, this one kind of hits a lot of the big Bender tropes. He takes on an entirely new career on a whim, being a matador, just something we've seen countless times over the series at this point. Dude has been like 30 different things over the series, despite literally being manufactured for one primary purpose, bending. I mean, professional wrestler, mafioso, Santa Claus, just to name a few. The list goes on and on. In addition, this is another episode adding to the ever-growing list of Bender's love interests with
Marquita, Maria, Cristina, Chiquita, Alana, Paloma, Ramon.
Actually, Bender's love interests might be a pretty interesting video topic. The Countess, Angeline, Bev, the Planet Express ship, Fanny, Lucy Lou's head, Amy. There are a lot. Marquita is a marginally interesting character. I like her design a lot, and the fact that Bender has to be trained by her adds a pretty interesting dynamic to their romance, makes it stand out a bit from his other flings. Their introduction to each other is a pretty fun sequence. The animation here when he's dodging the Bugalows in the street is so smooth. Kind of reminds me a little of his dance moves at this part of Bendin in the Wind. Now, obviously, there's a big reveal at the end that changes a lot about what we know about the Bugalo, but this episode's first big lore addition is that they introduce these bigger male bull Bugalows for the running of the Bugalows and the Matador fights.
Bugalo matadors only fight the males.
How do I
keep missing these things?
I think that's what we're all asking, Hermes. Where have they been? Buggalo were actually first introduced on the moon all the way back in the second episode of the entire show, aptly titled The Series Has Landed, and expanded on substantially in Where the Buggalo Roam. In their handful of appearances across the series, they've only ever been portrayed as these female variants. Though this isn't necessarily a huge retcon, they show that the Buggalo are both used for milk as well as meat, obviously the same as cows here on Earth, and at least here in the United States, you see cows about 50 times more often than you see bulls. I guess the one thing that makes it harder to believe is that suddenly the Wongs have like just this huge herd of the actual Buggalo bulls, not just the female variants. But you know what? I think it's a fun addition to the lore, so who cares? It's also kind of funny that the running of the Buggalos is so clearly pulling from Spanish traditions, but the event is seemingly being entirely run by the Wongs, who are clearly not Spanish.
We got a great group of Buggalo and a lazy-looking bunch of runners. So sign those liability waivers?
But this obviously aids in the running bit where everything on Mars is run by the outrageously wealthy Wong family.
We're not as rich as everybody says.
They own tons of Martian land in addition to the Wong Ranch. They were in charge of the entire construction of Mars Vegas. They clearly have deep ties to Mars University.
What sorority do you belong to?
Kappa Kappa Wong.
This stuff was all established in the second ever episode. They really had a lot of these ideas worked out early. Okay, let's talk about this announcer character, Don Cunningham, because this is kind of an interesting inclusion. I had honestly completely forgotten about him. Basically, in 2017, between the end of the Comedy Central era and the Hulu era of the show, the cast and crew worked with Nerdist to make a sort of audio drama episode of Futurama. It was called Radio-Rama. Within that story, they revealed that Futurama's usual transition announcer actually has a name.
As the podcast began, the audience was treated to the dulcet tones of the All My Circuits announcer, who happened to be yours truly, Don Cunningham.
This was obviously included because it being an audio drama meant they had to rely heavily on the announcer, but with the reveal, most fans took this to mean that all of Maurice LaMarche's transition narrator performances were, in fact, Don Cunningham, even though he definitely does different style voices for different projects, like here in Anthology of Interest.
Interesting stuff. Stay tuned for more Tales of Interest!
The Cunningham we hear in this episode and Radio-Rama definitely feels more in line with something like the transcredible exploits of Zap Brannigan announcer.
Brought to you by Bartley's Rocket Wax.
I wax my rocket every day.
But back in Radio-Rama, this was sort of a strange reveal because a non-textual character in Futurama, the transition announcer, is now also a textual character. They reveal that he does the narration for All My Circuits.
Hi, this is your announcer, Don Cunningham, welcoming all our listeners here on Earth, as well as our brave robots in uniform fighting mostly against each other.
But obviously Radio-Rama is sort of a weird relic of the previous cancellation era. It's a fun project for the cast and crew, but its sort of canonicity didn't need to be taken too seriously since it wasn't a real episode. However, here in Beauty and the Bug is Don Cunningham himself making his first on-screen appearance, looking a bit like Maurice LaMarche, might I say, his voice actor.
The Red Planet will run red today with the blood of its bravest heroes. Also their guts.
The episode basically just assigns him to be the sports commentator for the running of the Buggalos as well as the Buggalo Matador fights, and they give him his own goofy quirks that weren't really established in Radio-Rama. His whole thing is that he's constantly trying to get home to beat traffic, but still doing his commentary while in the car.
I'm in my car now on the way home. But what's this? I hear the crowd roaring behind me.
He was probably one of the funnier aspects of the episode for me. They don't explicitly call him out as the Futurama transition announcer or anything, though they do sort of once again place him outside of the text of the show as well, showing that after the credits, he is watching the episode on TV. What a weird character. Such a deep cut, and one I honestly did not even remember from the radio play. I guess I have to listen to that again. It's been a long time. This show is just always digging through its own history, and that's kind of fun. Beauty and the Bug also works pretty well as a Bender episode because alongside his new job and new romance, he goes through a tiny bit of an existential crisis. Not a big who am I type crisis like we saw in the season premiere or countless other episodes, but a smaller crisis of confidence, not knowing why his success hasn't brought him joy.
Something I've never felt before.
Guilt?
Maybe.
And then, of course, there's the whole Bugalo can talk reveal, which we're made to wonder if Bender hallucinated or if it actually happened. On paper, I think Bender's plan to suss this out and save the Bugalo from being murdered is a pretty fun one. He basically is doing something sneaky and disruptive, very Bender, but for more personal, noble reasons.
I don't usually do the right thing, but I'll be ruining everyone's day, so it balances out.
And then there's the ultimate lore reveal, of course, that the Bugalo not only can actually talk, but it's because they are all connected as a hive mind. And the funny subversive twist that though we might expect they shouldn't be used for Matador fights because they're intelligent, they themselves have other plans.
But most of all, we have a deep love of Bugalo fighting.
I also think the ever-expanding exploration of Mars in Futurama is pretty interesting. At this point, we've seen a pretty wildly diverse number of areas on Mars, which makes sense since it seems to be pretty heavily inhabited in the future. So far, we've seen Mars University, the jungles of Mars, the ancient Martian reservation, Olympus Mons, which is an actual volcano on Mars, the Wong Ranch, Mars Vegas, and now this Spanish-inspired location. It really feels like the only connection they had to use Mars and the Spanish-inspired stuff is the Bugalo. Since Bugalos are the cow stand-ins, they were like, well, let's just use Bugalo for the Running of the Bulls parody. And it's kind of funny that they've now used Bugalo on Mars for both Western-inspired cowboy-type stories and now this Spanish-inspired Matador story. Honestly, my favorite thing about this episode was probably the Spanish-inspired imagery and background gags. The sequence at the sort of street fair after Bender succeeds in his Bugalo fight has such a cool color palette, and I loved this guitar-playing flamenco dancing street music machine. Also, the paella stand joke is very Futurama, big fan. And I love that nobody even explains the Basura joke to Leela or the audience. That was just very funny. Also, not sure where else to put this, but I loved this alien rooster. What a funny design. It's interesting, writing out everything about this episode, it all totally tracks on paper. The characterizations feel right. They do some world building and lore expansion, they do some deep cut pulls for characters, and yet, this is probably my least favorite of the season. I didn't think it was particularly bad, there aren't any egregious jokes or references that I find obnoxious, nothing about the story that I find frustrating from a story perspective. I just sort of found myself a bit bored by this one, which is funny because it is doing a decent amount in terms of Futurama lore and deep cut fan service. This one just stands out the least to me, but who knows, maybe I'll like it more when I rewatch it in a few years. I'm already finding that a lot of the episodes I really didn't care for in the Comedy Central era are more enjoyable on my reevaluation. Sometimes things hit different years later. But I think that's all I've got for you for The Beauty and the Bug.
This has been Don Cunningham. Good night, everybody.
Futurama's 5th episode of season 9/12 just released, titled One is Silicon and the Other Gold, an obvious play on the song Make New Friends, which is of course a very apt title for this Leela-focused episode. And I think a Leela episode is welcomed by the fan base after some mildly growing concerns about her characterization in the Hulu era, delivering what I think is a pretty strong story, so let's dive into it. So, probably less so than the NFT episode, but I think this one will immediately turn some fans off with its topical Inferno Fest music festival up top, an obvious play on the infamous Fire Festival, which happened like 7 years ago at this point. While I find it mildly annoying, I think this delayed topical bit was actually used decently effectively, especially how it fits into the larger themes of the episode. Also, I thought a lot of the jokes leading into it were very funny.
Just another music festival.
Inferno Fest is not just another music festival!
I was wrong, Bender.
I love that delivery. This entire first act is basically just the crew getting stoked on Inferno Fest, except for Leela, and then going to said Inferno Fest, which is interesting. Leela honestly has very little presence in the first act of a decidedly Leela episode, but I still think it works thematically. Also, comedically, Fry is just draining threes in this first scene.
I'm not going.
But you love things like this.
I do?
No, I was trying to trick you.
For the most part, when it comes to Inferno Fest itself, I could sort of take or leave the parody bits. Obviously, it was playing on the many real issues that people at Firefest faced: the lack of bathrooms, the poor housing accommodations, the awful food, most of the bands dropping out, all pretty standard parody fare. I did really enjoy seeing Wailing Fungus return, first introduced back in Bendin' in the Wind, performing alongside Bender and Beck at Bend Aid.
Featuring back, Wailing Fungus! and special guest Bender.
It's great to see classic characters like this make a return, especially in a way that makes sense. Hopefully, this won't be the last we see of Wailing Funk. The musical lineup in the Inferno Fest commercial drops some other punny music artists alongside the classic Cylon and Garfunkel as well. I particularly liked Bruno Earth and Lady Galaga, but for me, the episode really picks up after Inferno Fest, when it gets into the bulk of the Leela story. While the crew is away, Leela spends her time chatting with her new friend Chelsea, who it's later revealed is an AI chatbot. And before you say this is topical, AI is like a fundamental part of science fiction, and chatbots have been around for 20 plus years. This is a pretty standard subject for Futurama, but this episode being so specifically Leela focused was very welcome for me, particularly because it didn't seem to have some of the characterization problems we've seen in the new era. I haven't talked about this all that much, but it seems like a good opportunity here. It just feels like they don't quite know what to do with Leela in this era. Her relationship with Fry has progressed in a strong and meaningful way. That stuff all works, but as a character on her own, it feels like she's kind of all over the place. There are seemingly new gags about her like really being into alcohol that I just do not recall ever being a thing before this era. Children of Lesser Bog made a joke about this.
Are you sure I wasn't drunk? I mean, I'm drunk now.
And then I Know What You Did Next Xmas had this gag where she was like trying to slurp up all the spilled eggnog with a straw. And then I think people really took issue with how she was used in this season's Quids Game. And I can't disagree. I quite liked that episode, but a lot of Leela's behavior during the games themselves felt very out of character. Begging Fry to basically sacrifice himself for her, and then barely batting an eye after he agrees. It felt like Leela's characterization was taking a back seat to the beats that Fry needed to hit for the episode. Even the last episode felt like a cause Leela would have really taken up with the Bugalo rights, but she pointedly looked the other way, although at least they got a really funny joke out of it.
Leela, you're not gonna participate in this, are you?
How about we let this be your issue?
But I think that's actually why this episode works so well for me. It almost seems to be in conversation with the show's struggle to find Leela's new place in the series outside of her relationship with Fry, pointedly making the plot about Leela finding new friends outside of the main crew and outside of her relationship with Fry.
I love you, Fry, but you can't be everything. I need a girlfriend I can just gab with about whatever.
So putting Leela in this book-turned-wine club alongside a good mix of other female characters across the series worked well for me, even though I saw the big twist coming a mile away.
I'm Phoebe. I like true crime, because it gives me ideas.
We'll get there, though. Leela is definitely a bit tight-laced and by the books in some ways. She's got fiery passion about certain causes, but in her day-to-day, she's the one who keeps the main Planet Express trio on track. So it was fun to see her sort of let loose and ignore the rules with her new gal pals. This is almost a reflection of her first real character turn back in the pilot. She was so focused on falling in line at her job, she didn't see what was best for her or the people around her.
Lots of people don't like their jobs, but we do them anyway. You gotta do what you gotta do.
I can see how her sort of going through that process again now, 150 some episodes into the show, could be seen as a little rehashy, but I think it works as this sort of Leela reset, and in response to how the show has used her recently. She's fallen in line at Planet Express so thoroughly over the years that she's failed to really find herself outside of it, and in turn, the show sort of has as well. It kind of reminds me of how in the late Philip J. Fry, in the timeline where Fry, Bender, and the Professor disappear, Leela ends up taking over Planet Express and turning it into this massive successful company, but at the expense of her own personal life and happiness. So I don't know, I guess it was just sort of nice on a personal level to see Leela letting loose and making new connections.
This is the best day of my life. It's hard for me to say this, but I've always had trouble making female friends.
This tracks too. I can't remember a single female friend Leela has made over the course of the series. It's always dates or Fry or work. Perfect timing for things to go awry though, as Phoebe gets caught in this giant wine bottle, giving us what might be one of the funniest comedic reveals in the new era.
She's gonna make it! She's dead.
So the big ultimate reveal that Chelsea and Phoebe were one and the same, and that this was all the AI's ploy to get Leela to have a shared experience with her friends was a bit obvious for me, but I think it works well given the story. It's why I don't really hate that the episode started with the Firefest parody. That was a big shared traumatic event that brought the crew closer together, and now Leela got to have one of those with her new friends. Plus, ending the episode with them just repeatedly beating Phoebe's bloated wine-filled RoboCorpse was very funny. I also really loved the whole boys book book club subplot. So funny that they were just so staunchly against the idea only for them to fully embrace it. Also had some really great gags. I loved Fry bringing his Hardy Boys-esque kids series to mixed reactions.
May I suggest Adventure Boys number 10, The Ghost of Ghost Mountain?
There were honestly some really funny gags throughout this entire B story.
To be honest, I was expecting Of Mice and Men to be about a man-mouse hybrid.
This episode also had a few kind of curious gags as well. For the first time since I believe the series has landed, they brought back this Bender line.
We should form our own book club with blackjack and hookers. In fact, forget the books.
This was a runner in its initial appearance, and I'm not entirely sure how I feel about them just sort of using the same joke again. Bringing back something like the professor's "I was already in my pajamas" bit is funny because that was set up to be a repeated catchphrase, but then was abandoned after 2 episodes. The blackjack and hookers line is funny, but it was just a specific joke in an old episode. It would have been nice if they had some kind of new twist on it rather than just playing the hits. This joke also stood out to me.
You can smoke what you pick. I mean, eat what you pick.
Is this the first time that La Barbara has dropped a weed joke? Usually it's a Hermes thing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think she's ever delivered a similar gag herself. I just found that interesting. Overall, I liked this episode. The Inferno Fest thing definitely felt a little too, oh, remember this thing that happened? But they at the very least tied it into the larger story and themes effectively. It was nice to see them sort of reconcile with Leela's place in the show. We got a good focus on a bunch of side characters. Loved seeing Hedonism Bot's Winery. Great use of that character, and that boys book club subplot is a true banger. So many good laughs in there, and just conceptually super funny. I hope this episode is a sort of turning point for how they use Leela moving forward. We've got at least 25 more episodes of Futurama over the next few years, and it would be a shame if it felt like they struggled with how to utilize Leela across the rest of the show until it ends inevitably again.
Another job well done.
Futurama's 6th episode of the season is a professor-focused story called Attack of the Clothes, one of the most professor-centric stories in the entire Hulu era thus far. This story has a ton of variety, moving from science to fashion to a pretty eerie, supernatural environmental message about waste. This one has some wildly creative ideas, and the more I watch it, the more I appreciate it. So let's deploy Futurama episode breakdown.
Deployer? I barely know her. Just kidding, I'm a regular customer.
It's always a good sign when a Futurama starts with a gag that I really appreciate right up top, and the rotation of the Planet Express building, making it a giant sewing needle, really did it for me. This thing is gags on gags. You've got a funny All My Circuits scene playing while the crew actively ignores the fact that the building is rotating, except for Fry, who buckles up just in time until the couch falls. Silly stuff that I really enjoyed. The whole first part of this episode is the professor prepping for another Academy of Inventors competition with a simple experiment: creating a Frankenstein. I really enjoyed this story, using the shady black market body part salesman to harvest parts, and teasing the professor's love for fashion that would come into play later in the episode.
Is that a flat lap scene?
Why, thank you for noticing, Amy. It looks elegant and minimizes blood loss.
I also think the professor's science experiments moving into bizarre supernatural territory is always super funny. This feels a lot like when he was going to resurrect Seymour in Jurassic Park, or the satanic ritual to resurrect Calculon. Damn, actually the professor really likes resurrecting stuff, doesn't he? Okay, let's talk about the guest star this week, Cara Delevingne, who, though maybe a little random, does a great job. Basically the only model who is willing to slap her head on the professor's giant misshapen Frankenbody. She's a really fun presence throughout the episode. Sometimes guest stars with that much focus can distract from the story, but she just felt like a natural extension of the professor's fashion storyline. But this is also crazy because this is like the 4th episode that Cara Delevingne has been credited in as a guest star, despite being the first episode where she's playing herself. And according to IMDb, they've been having her play owls for various episodes. Last season's The Impossible Stream and I Know What You Did Next Xmas, and this season's The Temp. She must have just been really good at making owl noises when she guest starred, and they decided to throw her into a bunch of different episodes. That's pretty great, honestly. When the owls in your show are voiced by a pretty massive actress, you're doing pretty well. It's like when George Clooney played Sparky the dog on South Park. But the big inciting incident is that aforementioned Academy of Inventors competition, which for all intents and purposes seems to be the exact same kind of competition competition we saw back in Season 1's A Big Piece of Garbage, though it had a slightly different event title back then.
It's the Academy of Inventors Annual Symposium. Wow, I love symposia.
But outside of them using the word competition instead of symposium, this seems to be nearly identical. It's at the same building, same stage, same ugly green curtains, celebrity guest host, last time Ron Popeil, this time Bill Nye the Science Head. Even the trophies are the same design. This competition had a fun old school Futurama vibe. I loved seeing Bubblegum Tate and Sweet Clyde as members. They weren't introduced until after that first symposium. I also thought Wernstrom's invention, which recycled old doomsday devices and turned them into pets for the elderly, was so funny. The shape of this missile dog is amazing.
Come along, Explodey. And last up.
Also very funny that Wernstrom always has animal-focused inventions for these competitions. Last time he had this out-of-water suit for his pet fish. But the turn in the episode comes when the other scientists are far more interested in the dress that the professor had designed for Kara than her resurrected Franken body. And honestly, the way he made them is such a cool concept, one of my favorite aspects of the episode. Basically, it was initially just a way to create specifically tailored clothes for Kara's unique new proportions.
No clothing will ever fit you. There's just no possible way to... I've got it!
He scans the bodies, encodes the scans into RNA, injects that RNA into these giant silkworms, who weave a cocoon that can be flipped inside out to reveal immaculate new clothes, perfectly fitting the person scanned. Very fun Futurama shenanigans.
I've never expected to love something so much that was excreted from a moth.
So with the scientists at the Academy of Inventors being more interested in the fashion, the professor decides that maybe his days of being an inventor are over, since they haven't really led to all that much.
It's time to admit I should have pursued my first love, fashion.
I don't know why this just works for me. It lines up with some jokes we've seen previously, even ones that I wasn't particularly fond of, like in Bender's Game when there was a runner that the professor had been inventing a whole line of makeup for dogs. And while this whole fashion sequence of the episode is definitely the most sort of pop culture referencey, that's where this kind of episode should be using those kinds of references. It fits pretty naturally. And it also wasn't just some out-of-place cameo fest. They also utilized a lot of characters from the show's history who wanted to wear the professor's clothes, starting with...
It's Gladys Lennox, the world-famous paramecium.
I think this is the first time we've heard this character's name, but this is Miss Vega 4 from the Miss Universe contest from The Lesser of Two Evils. This is a great callback, a famous model with a bizarrely shapen body. It's a perfect implementation of Futurama lore into this new story. She also wears the outfit to the premiere of her new movie, Lawrence of Amebia. God, I love that pun. That is great. Other characters interested in using his line include that funny-shaped robot from All My Circuits, as well as the cupcake alien from Yoli Lalila. So they were just pulling from all over the place in this one. But poor Zoidberg, despite being a part of the professor's crew, is turned away for his lack of style.
But I'm on the list, right there.
No, you're not. You're dressed like some sort of underpaid lobster doctor from outer space.
And because of this, they deliver an act break where Zoidberg jumps off a bridge. That is a wild move, even if you know Zoidberg isn't gonna die. It's also revealed that he wasn't actually killing himself, he was just going underwater where fashion standards are lower except for Umbrielle from the Deep South, who shows up for her second cameo in the Hulu era. But Zoidberg's devastation basically convinces the professor that fashion for only the elite isn't what he wants to do.
You know, I've never told anyone this, but it's been my lifelong dream to be a famous scientist. Perhaps I could use science to bring fashion to the masses.
Have we ever seen this Morbo and Linda show before, Good Morning Tonight? Great title, and I loved Morbo's giant beanie over his bulbous head. A really fun way for the professor to reveal his program is coming to everyone, despite a surprising needle drop from Nicki Minaj's Starships for this whole sequence. Kind of random, a little dated, but I don't know, fine. But this really does improve Zoidberg's social standing, and they show him on a hot date, and they even bang it out in his dumpster afterwards. And yeah, I know, people are probably mad because Marianne has not been mentioned or referenced even once in the Hulu era, and now we're even showing Zoidberg dating other people. I sort of was already anticipating this, back when she wasn't even referenced in last season's Xmas episode. I really think they're just abandoning her as a character, which I understand will upset some fans. Stench and Stenchability is such a good episode, and they were very sweet together. But I also understand why the writers maybe wanted to undo this. When that episode aired, it was meant to be Zoidberg's happy ending, with the show ending for what they expected to be the final time. And it works great as a capper to Zoidberg's story, but Zoidberg's entire game in this show is that he gets absolutely dumped on in every area of his life, despite really being the one character who doesn't deserve that at all. It makes sense that just giving him an amazing love life to go back to at the end of every day doesn't really work for the comedy aspect of his character. And with how they've struggled a little bit with Leela in the post-Fry and Leela are officially a couple era, I'm not sure that I'm all that torn up about it. Like, I do really love them together, but I just think comedy needs to be the priority here. But who knows, maybe they'll actually reference this in the future? Maybe the events of the time freeze from Meanwhile somehow messed with the recent history around that time, which is when Stench and Stenchability happened, and we'll get some kind of return or reference to Marianne later. Hey, a man can dream, right? Anyways, this is where the episode really starts to focus on one of its classic Futurama pro-environmental messages, commenting on the wasteful nature of fast fashion. Every outfit the professor makes is designed to last only a single day.
It's fast fashion at its fastiest.
And this leads to the incredibly dark commentary to complete that environmental message. One of my favorite aspects of this season of Futurama is how Twilight Zone some of these stories have felt. Between Quids Game, the Temp, and now Attack of the Clothes, there is a very eerie supernatural vibe to some of them. So this whole reveal that we've sent the clothes through a wormhole to the future is really fun, but not just because it's a very fun sci-fi twist, but because it's also a perfect metaphor for the dangers of the fast fashion it's commenting on. The entire theme of the initial Academy competition was recycling, and by abandoning science, Farnsworth basically created one of the most wasteful industries possible. And the fitting message at the end of the episode is that Earth will soon be buried in clothes if fast fashion doesn't resort to less wasteful methods of production, which is what makes the ending beat so great.
Don't you see, you imbecile? No, sir, I'm afraid I don't.
No, not that beat, but that's basically how people are going to react to it. I'm sure some people have an issue with this simply not having a resolution, but what better way is there to send that message than to not fix the problem retroactively? The only way to stop this kind of waste is to do it now, or in their past, basically. And the ending beat is just so eerie. It's amazing. I love it on an artistic level even more than a commentary level. Honestly, the more I talk about this episode, the more I love it. I think it's quickly moving up my ranking for the season.
We sent the clothes to our own future.
Futurama's latest episode, Planet Espresso, is the rare Hermes-focused story and the return of a beloved writer from the Fox era, Bill Odenkirk. And the episode is a fun mix of parody, commentary, and good old-fashioned character work. A solid return for Bill, so let's dive into it. So as I mentioned, this is the rare Hermes-focused story. Honestly, across all 150 plus episodes of the show, there aren't that many that focus on Hermes, and the ones that exist aren't often particularly standout. How Hermes requisitioned his groove back is a really great episode, but honestly, if you go back and watch it, Hermes is kind of barely in it, despite an amazing musical climax that he's in. Lethal Inspection is also a really great Hermes episode, with the caveat that it maybe stands out more for being a Bender story. The $6 Million Man is maybe a little underrated from the Comedy Central era, but the last Hermes-focused episode we got, Rage Against the Vaccine from last season, was not one of my favorites, and probably not one of the fandom favorites either. But this is actually the furthest back we go into Hermes' history, showcasing a little bit of his childhood in Jamaica and revealing his parents for the very first time, basically explaining how and why Hermes' father abandoned him when he was young, after losing his business to a hurricane.
With a pressure drop so low, it destroyed my father's barometer store.
Okay, I always write these videos before I look at how fans feel about the episode, but this comment on Reddit was so good that I had to go back and add a pickup pointing it out, so shout out to Kermit the Fraud 92 for this catch. The entire flashback sequence is actually a callback to the song from the end of When Hermes Requisitioned His Groove Back, where he sings about a hurricane in Kingston Town. Check out this verse with the new footage.
Everyone was alright, but I cried all night. It blew my alphabet blocks out of order.
Great Futurama attention to detail. I also enjoyed them sneaking in this little limbo joke even when Hermes was tiny.
How low can it go?
All of this is revealed through the fact that Hermes' father is on his deathbed and that Hermes has to go to Jamaica to see him before he dies. I did really enjoy the singing telegram to inform Hermes of such terrible news. Also that they're making sure to show more mutants are getting jobs and living on the surface after the mutants are revolting. It felt like they didn't quite do enough of that towards the end of the Comedy Central run. And I also appreciated that this entire first act is basically selling the same joke about Hermes' dad's farm.
They say he went off into the woods to grow some exotic crop.
Exotic Jamaican crop? It could be anything.
Sort of felt like the entire series of Hermes weed jokes was building up to this bit, obviously then revealing that he is growing coffee beans.
What'd you think he was growing?
Pumpkins. Medicinal pumpkins.
And that first act ends with a really fun sci-fi reveal that I did not expect, as Hermes and the professor discover this massive underground spaceship. This episode, while super focused on Hermes, also pairs him with the professor, and this obviously isn't the first time. Episodes like The Root of All Evil and Bender Should Not Be Allowed on Television showcase both Hermes and the professor as a duo, though typically those stories are told from the perspective of the pair as fathers, usually dealing with Dwight and Cubert's own misadventures or bad behavior. Root of All Evil was actually the episode that introduced Dwight. This episode definitely focuses on Hermes as a dad, but not so much the professor. Despite this, they work really great as a pair. There were some really fun details in the spaceship they discovered as well. For one, the design of the ship itself was just really cool. I also think this was the first time we ever saw the Futurama alienese language literally be translated on screen with the professor's hand translator. When that scene started, I was like, oh, dope, I've got so much alienese to translate for the breakdown, but then he just translated it himself. I also appreciated the professor just continually tasting random fluids on the ship, which is a weird trope we see in media in general, but then the reveal that these fluids were all coffee was pretty good.
Coffee?
Stop tasting stuff!
Which paired great with the professor's disgust when Hermes drank the actual coffee. I think this is a good time to talk about that great cold open, parodying 2001: A Space Odyssey, with the apes drinking coffee for the first time. Visually, it is very funny, and it really sets up this entire sci-fi angle of the episode. Hermes and the professor drink this coffee, which sends him into a trippy hallucinatory flashback, revealing the true nature of the spaceship and all of the coffee.
No way, man. We're just whacked out of our gourds. It's like a vision of what went down 5 million years ago. Dig?
I also thought this was a really funny delivery from Farnsworth. It reminded me of the last episode that Bill Odenkirk wrote, the Farnsworth Parabox, when they met the hippie alternate version of the professor.
Dude, there's a universe in all of us.
Right on, Professor Freaksworth.
Get a job!
But this big flashback was a really great premise. Basically, this alien species brings coffee beans to various planets to help species transition and elevate to a higher plane of existence. It's sort of like the stoned ape theory, except with coffee, and really brings it all back to that 2001 parody from the intro. But this ship crash landed on their last stop on Earth, leaving the beans in the ship, buried below this Jamaican farm. And so, after learning this, Hermes feels it's his responsibility to help elevate the collective consciousness of the planet and become a bean farmer, even if it means being away from his family. The way this led to Planet Express becoming Planet Espresso was very funny, and I think we can all agree that if this had come out a year or two later, we'd probably have had a Sabrina Carpenter montage in the middle of it. Futurama's always just a little late like that. Look, animation takes a long time. This whole Fry B story where he's horribly overworked at the new espresso shop while the rest of the crew just oversees him as management felt pretty classic to me, and we got a great Kyle MacLachlan cameo.
Sorry, Mr. McLaughlin. Here's your usual.
Oh, that's a damn fine bath of coffee.
This was incredible timing for me. I just started rewatching Twin Peaks, and I'll never not be salty that MacLachlan didn't win 4 separate Emmys for his performances in Twin Peaks: The Return alone, but I digress. This is actually Kyle's second cameo in this new era of Futurama, appearing in Parasites Regained last season because of his role as Paul Atreides in David Lynch's Dune.
Could he be the Quiznos Cadillac?
Legends supporting legends, let's be real. The entire business aspect was fun as well. We see Hermes sort of refuse to give over the company to Mom, fearing that their goal will be abandoned to make a quick buck. This also led to a great Professor X Mom moment that I appreciated.
Get out and take your dirty, sexy money with you. Whoa.
And these decisions, of course, continue to keep Hermes away from his family, and on a character level, that is really what this episode is about. It's an episode about generational trauma.
Are you really going to abandon your boy the way your father did?
And not just how that generational trauma passed down through Hermes by his father, but it's also about Hermes coming to understand his father's decisions and his past. At the beginning of the episode, Hermes reuniting with his father is just filled with resentment and hatred. He spent his entire life feeling that resentment towards his father, and now that they're finally face to face, it's his time to unload, to get all of it off of his chest. But of course, he doesn't actually get his opportunity.
What kind of man leaves his family to fend for themselves? I'll tell you what kind.
But then later in the episode, after Hermes' dad's reanimated corpse grows into this coffee plant, Hermes gets one last chance to speak to him and let him know how he feels, but that conversation does not go the way he anticipated. He learns his dad's actual motivations.
I became obsessed with the farm. I was working for the good of all humanity, except my own family.
And so Hermes realizes that he has now made the exact same mistake with the exact same motivations that his father did. He realizes how easy it can be to lose sight of what's important when working towards a bigger goal. He sees that he and his father are more alike than he ever wanted to admit, but he also, once again, gets another opportunity to give his father his final thoughts.
But now, all I want to say to you is...
I'm good at this.
I love these bookends to the episode so much. In both instances, Hermes does not get a chance to say his final words to his father, but it wasn't really ever about his father hearing those words. It was always about Hermes coming to terms with his father's decisions. The first time through overwhelming resentment, and the second time through painful understanding and gratitude for helping him see his own shortcomings. It's a really nice sentiment. It's a really sweet ending. Obviously, lots of cartoons explore generational trauma, and this one certainly does so in a classically Futurama fashion. Shows like BoJack Horseman would maybe be more intent on letting us dwell in the bad decisions that have been made that pass down that trauma, as an understanding for why these characters act the way they do, but not in a way that makes us feel good. Futurama chooses a bit more of an upbeat, heartfelt portrayal. Hermes finds relief in the discovery that his father had noble goals, even if he got the short end of that deal. And the little epilogue here was pretty great too, with Hermes returning to his family.
You both mean more to me than all the talking shrubs and prehistoric space aliens in Jamaica.
And then, of course, we got this one last little sequence, the big sci-fi twist, the reveal that the motivations of those prehistoric aliens were actually very self-serving. They wanted to force humanity to become dependent on coffee so that they can remain awake 24 hours a day and perform menial labor. Maybe some commentary that hits a little too close to reality, but it does pair perfectly with Fry's comedic B-plot. And a really great touch that these aliens are basically the Starbucks mermaids, showing how they've infiltrated every street in the world. Hey, this was a fun episode. I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about the whole Planet Express is a coffee shop now story, but this episode is a pretty excellent balance of that story, a fun underlying sci-fi premise, some actual world and social commentary, and of course some heartfelt and well-structured character work for Hermes. Honestly, this is probably one of my favorite Hermes episodes. A very strong return for series veteran Bill Odenkirk, who I hope will continue on the series for the next 20 episodes.
But stay just a little longer.
Futurama's latest episode was called Cuteness Overlord and marks the return of Kristen Gore to the writer's room. Her previous script credit on Futurama was all the way back on Leela's Homeworld, which is obviously a classic. This one takes an incredibly old school fad and throws a sci-fi twist on it, as well as does some great work expanding on Amy and Kif's new lives with kids. So let's get into it. Okay, first off, I watched this on my computer and I almost clicked the CAPTCHA icon during the title sequence. That really got me. Good title gag. But this episode opens on Amy and Kif struggling a bit as parents, and that's something I'm really glad that the show is focusing on now. The original run had some parenting-focused episodes after introducing Hubert and Dwight, so it's nice to see them extend over to Kif and Amy in that regard, especially because Kif and Amy have a very different life circumstance that makes for some interesting storytelling.
I don't get why my kids are so spoiled. We have tons of money, we give them everything they want, and still, totally spoiled.
I think this is a really smart angle to explore with Amy and her kids. I feel like the show doesn't quite dive all that deep into how Amy's wealth affects her own mentality. There are sometimes jokes about her being rich and offhanded references to her privilege, but for the most part, she acts very normal and is very well adjusted. Though the scene where she's trying to buy a car stands out as a good example of them utilizing her wealth status pretty well.
I'm sorry, 80,000?
But obviously, Amy comes from wealth and is very well off, and so focusing on how that spoiled mentality trickles down to her kids, I think, is a very smart way to tackle her parental story. It sets it apart from other father-son stories we've gotten from Farnsworth/Qbert and Hermes/Dwight, and tying into the orphanarium is a nice touch as well, with Amy taking the kids there to try and teach them a lesson. Though it's definitely funny that these orphans have not aged in what is canonically like 24 years. I think the whole rundown orphanarium stuff tends to work. There are some really good gags in here, like the leaning table and the raccoon in the wall.
That's Bandit. He gave me my first rabies.
Though I do wish that we had maybe gotten a little bit of a callback to the fact that Bender once adopted all of these children.
Can you fix our table, Mr. Shiny Pants?
I think it would have been a sweet and subtle callback if they had called him Daddy Bender here instead, but obviously this is kind of a wish list nitpick. But this episode also kind of paints Amy in a bad light, showcasing her poor parenting skills thus far.
I apologize, kids. That was just horrible. I'll buy you all ponies to make up for it.
But I really loved the important character developments here, that Mandy loves the orphanarium and is really attached to Sally, the orphan.
Can I at least give her a hug goodbye? I said not to touch anything dirty.
And then also that Amy has a lot of her own growth to do in both the parenting and not being spoiled department. But I like that this is the lesson she has to learn in this episode, which is also weirdly all about the Beanie Baby obsession of the 90s, with a sci-fi twist, of course. I'm really curious how people will feel about this premise. Like, what is the statute of limitations for when people complain about things that are topical? This is obviously not currently topical, but it is parodying a hyper-specific cultural phenomenon. It just happens to be one that happened 30 years ago. And it was a pretty wild fad that rose and fell so quickly, but damn were people obsessed with these little beanbags. And I think this is a pretty solid storyline for Amy to get caught up in, driven by her wealth/spoiled nature in order to teach her a lesson about parenting.
Now that I know they're hard to get, I want them!
The montage of Amy hunting for all the fun bags she's missing was great, and honestly maybe a little too relatable personally, as someone who will every so often just fixate on something super specific that I need to collect. I also like that Kip's B-plot showcases that since he's more or less a military dad, he's often out on assignment, leaving Amy to solo parent and exacerbating the issues that they're exploring in the story, which then also leads to Amy bailing on her kids at the orphanarium to try and track down the rarest fuzzy fun bag of all, the cuddly cuttlefish, which, as it turns out, was actually at the orphanarium all along. In fact, if you look closely at this early sequence when Hermes passes Sally the fuzzy fun bags, you can see that third one in the trio is the carefully hidden cuttlefish behind the other two. The little glimpses are unmistakable. Also, when Amy comes to get Mandy from Sally's room, the cuttlefish is hidden off to the side here, but still technically in view. I think this episode does a pretty great job tying all of its stories together into the climax. Amy is obsessively collecting the fun bags, the Planet Express crew is now basically exclusively delivering fuzzy fun bags, and then Kif and Zap are investigating a mystery that turns out to be related to those fuzzy fun bags. Honestly, this investigative scene on the space station has a really creepy vibe, and the way they drew all of these murdered dupe officers and their broken necks is kind of scary and gross. I really appreciated the big sci-fi angle on the Beanie Baby story here, that they actually aren't manufactured at all, they're living creatures that have evolved to be so adorable so that they can help infiltrate themselves into society, and also that the beans inside are actually eggs, which is very gross. There's a great sequence where they show things of varying degrees of cuteness, and the example of something ugly they use is this insane Bart Simpson drawing. We have to talk about it. It is so weird how just the slightest changes to the established design can make it almost look uncanny, but basically the face just looks a bit more like Futurama characters than Simpsons characters, even though Futurama and Simpsons have very similar character designs, and it does not look right. It's such a trip. It reminds me a bit of Simpsorama, which had the Simpsons animators drawing Futurama characters. Overall in that, they looked decent, but there were some shots where they just did not look quite right. This line from Mandy as Amy was coping with the harsh lesson she'd learned about herself was pretty funny.
Mommy did something wrong, and it's time to make it right. You mean abandoning us for weeks to go toy shopping?
Thank you for calling it out, Mandy. It is so blatantly neglectful that I'm just glad that they at least poked fun at it comedically in this. There's a pretty nice moment as Amy apologizes to Sally for trading her for the cuttlefish, and it's a pretty heart-wrenching moment where she's trying to swap them back.
It's special to me, because it's the first time a mommy ever gave me a present.
Oh my gosh, this poor girl. Can somebody please adopt Sally? Obviously, Bender adopted her and all the other kids, but in that same episode, Leela very pointedly wanted to adopt Sally. It's the thing that made her break up with Adelaide, and it's kind of sad that Sally was basically just used as a plot device to split them up and then still remained an orphan. Honestly, I would really like if Fry and Leela adopted her at some point. I think the show is likely pretty intent on giving Fry and Leela a biological child. There's the episode Law and Oracle, which was originally going to be about Fry and Leela's son moving backwards through time, a story I hope they still do eventually. But I hope that if we ever get any kind of epilogue type look at all these characters in the future, that Fry and Leela have both a biological child and have maybe adopted Sally. Leela was just so adamant about adopting with Adelaide. I think still choosing to adopt would make a ton of sense for her. The big finale of the episode works really well for me as well. Obviously, with the big fun bag reveal, it turns out that Amy giving the orphanarium her collection is actively putting all of the orphans in danger. I really loved the way they showcased the fun bags approaching and threatening the kids, never showing them move when the camera is on them, but having them approach closer each time it looks away. Basically, the weeping angel approach from Doctor Who. And the ultimate solution coming from Amy putting aside her terrible parenting and becoming more accepting of her kids' wants and needs works really great.
You and Mandy can play together as much as you want.
Especially how Mandy and Sally's friendship is the exact thing that finally ends the cuddly cuttlefish's reign of terror with this beautiful strangling hug. Honestly, the episode lived up to its title. It is a cute one. Also kind of gross in some places, but it's cute. Overall, I thought this was once again another strong episode. I particularly appreciate how it's using the slight status quo changes in the Hulu era to deliver us new stories we wouldn't have been able to get otherwise. It's nice to really focus on Amy and Kif as parents in a way that challenges Amy as a character and also utilizes aspects of her history that maybe haven't been utilized quite as well as they should have been. I also appreciated that this one sets Mandy apart from the other kids in the family, whereas previously they maybe kind of just felt like a little gang. This one decided to put the focus on that one specific kid. I'd say this is somewhere in the middle of the pack for the season for me, but it is a solid return for Kristen Gore and another just overall solid episode.
You're hugging too hard.
We have reached the seasonal Futurama anthology episode, which you either dread or look forward to depending on who you are. This year's is called the Futurama Mystery Library, transplanting our favorite interplanetary delivery crew into some classic young adult mystery books. And while I usually am one of those people who tends to dread these anthology episodes, this year, I gotta say, I was pleasantly surprised. We'll get into my general feelings on the anthologies in depth too, so, I don't know.
Throw another book on the fire and settle in.
Obviously, as not a huge fan of these anthology episodes in general, I rarely worry about what kind of theming they'll be using, but I have to admit, the adventure mystery book parodies worked so great this time. Partially because the mysteries in general are compelling, but also because they did a great job in each bringing sci-fi and scientific elements in as part of the reveal or resolution. Even though each parody was of something pointedly not very Futurama, they all brought the charms that make Futurama great to the table. And using LeVar Burton as the wraparound storyteller was inspired. Who doesn't love that guy? And some great Star Trek jokes right off the bat.
I didn't see you beam in because I had my sleep mask on.
Between being Geordi in Star Trek and the host of Reading Rainbow, I mean, there is quite literally no better possible host for the Futurama Mystery Library, am I right? Home run guest casting. It would have been actually weird if it was anybody else.
We're going to learn about the wonders of books and all the fun adventures you can have watching TV shows based on them.
The first story is called The Mystery of the Missing Mass, initially parodying Nancy Drew with Leela's Lancey True counterpart. The mystery itself is pretty simple. A bunch of stuff goes completely missing. That is the titular mass. Eventually, not only does the stuff go missing, but Lancey goes missing too, which is when Fry and Bender's Hardy Boys parallel tag in to take over the mystery, which is also pretty funny given that there was already a Hardy Boys book book parody within Futurama this season, The Adventure Boys. The big reveal is that all of this stuff has been sucked into a gravitational black hole. The mystery in this one is obviously pretty thin. It's literally just things go missing, but it does tie into the science theme. Missing Mass is the title because these things are being sucked into a singularity. But I think the character twists are maybe the most fun thing about the story. The Nancy Drew novels have a sort of weird publishing history. They started being published in 1930, and then in 1959, they also began rewriting and revising the first 34 books, primarily to make them more modern and eliminate the many racist stereotypes from the 30s versions. So all of those first 34 books have two different versions. There have been over 600 published Nancy Drew novels between 1930 and now, which is crazy. I had no idea there was such a massive library of just this series. And for a book series that's been going on that long, as you might expect, societal standards have shifted plenty. And so this Futurama story also clearly satirizes some of the tendencies of the Nancy Drew novels. Obviously, there is Amy's character Andy, based on George Fane from the novels, a character who they seemingly always make a point to describe as being a tomboy.
Guys, have you met my tomboyish friend Andy?
Why can't you just call me your friend, Andy?
In addition to this, a lot of the books in the 80s and 90s have been criticized for just being riddled with fat-shaming jokes and comments, as are the Hardy Boys novels, which are obviously also parodied in this. In those books, their friend Chet is the victim of these comments.
It's our portly pal, Chud. Why can't you just call me your pal, Chud? You somehow feel obligated to comment on my weight?
I thought it was pretty funny that they used these tendencies from these book series in a pretty integral part of the resolution. Their targeted behavior pushes Andy and Chud to let them all get sucked into the black hole as they escape together. Honestly, even though the mystery itself was kind of thin, the way the story played on the history of these novels was pretty fun and creative. As you might expect from Futurama, they did their research. The second story is an Adventures of Tintin parody. Since Tintin is originally in French, I appreciated that their translation of the French title came up as an alienese subtitle, which reads The Mystery of the Golden Crank. The story is probably my favorite of the episode. Visually, the Tintin style recreated looks so great. The way the outfits for the Tintin analogs are inspired by, but not direct adaptations of the actual Futurama characters' outfits, works really well. Leela's outfit in particular, I love, adapting her occasionally worn green jacket. Though it is kind of funny that new bit where Leela is just a full-on drunk/alcoholic is also making it into these anthology parodies now. Kind of a weird thing they've done in the Hulu era. But the way they adapted the Planet Express ship into this old-timey plane looks great. The landscapes and backgrounds of the world as they travel are stunning. I just love everything about how this one looks. I also loved how some of the sillier Futuramisms sort of infiltrated their way into the very Tintin-esque story, like this delivery from Mom.
Where in Butt's ass is my fiancé?
The mystery itself is also really interesting and compelling, once they get to it, that is. Tintin in general is a bit more supernatural in nature, so I appreciate that rather than have a sci-fi explanation for the magical crank, they actually just used the magical crank to explore something scientific, that being plate tectonics and the breaking up of Pangea. Cycling forward and backward through time was really awesome visually, and I found the reveal that Wernstrom, aka Geology's bones, were spread across 2 continents because of their golden crank shenanigans to be a really fun and satisfying resolution. Just an awesome ending to the episode. Honestly, this Tintin parody has got to be my favorite anthology segment since like 2011. It's so well done.
I saved the best for last. Oh, wait. I read them out of order.
Even though Tintin is the height of this episode for me, Wikipedia Brown had some stuff that I did really appreciate as well. For one, once again, these backgrounds utilizing this specific style that differentiate from the other segments made it look really good, and I also loved that they used Bender's child design from Teenage Mutant Leela's Hurdles. Speaking of Leela, she was also very funny in this.
I like to punch people.
Fry, Zoidberg, and Scruffy's greaser designs were great. I especially loved Fry's hair, and honestly, just conceptually, the idea that Lil Bender's parents are Earl and Petunia made me laugh a lot. That is such a funny pairing. Overall, this was definitely the least compelling mystery of the 3, but I think it had a really funny resolution, with Neil deGrasse Tyson entering the picture. You'd maybe expect that NDT would have been in Futurama previously, but he actually had only voiced himself in one of the Futurama Worlds of Tomorrow trailers.
Because
I'm the spokesman for anything with even the remotest connection to science.
Now look, I would normally say that a Tyson cameo feels maybe a little dated in 2024. The 2017 Worlds of Tomorrow cameo makes way more sense. However, I think the way they use him is actually pretty funny and plays a bit on the more recent reputation he's gotten for being a sort of sci-fi story party pooper, which if you aren't familiar, just look up any of his thoughts on almost any space-based movie in the past 10 years. Rather than giving an answer to the actual dog poop bag mystery, he describes it as matter and then tells them where all matter comes from.
All matter was created in the Big Bang. So that's where it came from.
So to have Neil deGrasse Tyson come in at the end and just explain a completely uninteresting and non-satisfying resolution with simple, cold, hard science is very funny to me, and I think it's maybe a sly nod to the fact that much of his criticism is so science-based that it would often make the actual storytelling much worse. I also appreciated that this shot of the Big Bang in this hologram was definitely pulled from the late Philip J. Fry's depiction of that event. But man, overall, this is another solid story. As I mentioned, in general, I have not been a huge fan of these anthology episodes. I loved the old What If Machine episodes from the Fox run. Reincarnation in the first half of the Comedy Central era is incredible. I enjoyed the specific Scooby-Doo parody and Saturday Morning Fun Pit, but outside of those, the anthologies are among my least favorite stories the show offers. In fact, I was maybe a little too mean to last year's anthology, The Prince and the Product, but boy, am I happy to say that this year was a really fun time. In fact, I think it sits pretty firmly as my fourth favorite, below Reincarnation and the Fox era anthology of interest episodes. In large part, that's because these episodes were just so much fun to look at. Each mystery/detective parody had a unique art style to match the subject it was parodying, and they were all animated really well. This is also something that generally holds true in other anthologies that parody other art styles. Reincarnation obviously looks amazing in its three styles, and Saturday Morning Fun Pit had a lot of fun parodying the older, cheaper animation, especially in that Scooby-Doo segment, but this one in particular just had outstanding backgrounds that were unique in each style, and then the standout segment visually was obviously the Tintin parody. That thing just looked incredible top to bottom. But most importantly, these mysteries were fun and compelling, staying true to the things they were parodying while adding in fun sci-fi twists and making them fittingly Futurama. Honestly, I am so happy to say that I like this one, because usually I just expect these anthologies won't be for me. This one very much was.
Remember, in space, no one can hear you read.
Can't believe it's happening again, but with the release of Futurama's Otherwise, we have now hit the 5th episode in the show's history that was written as a potential series finale. We also, of course, are going in knowing that it isn't the series finale, with 20 more episodes on the way over the next couple of years, but the Futurama writing staff always hedges their bets, and so we do know that this one could have been the end. It was written just in case. But how did it compare to the previous 4 potential series finales? Would this have been a satisfying ending? Honestly, it feels like a little bit of deja vu asking all these questions.
Deja vu? I feel like I've heard of that before. No, wait, I'm thinking of De La Soul.
Okay, so first off, I do think it's kind of important to note that because we know there are 20 more episodes coming in the future, and that this episode isn't going to be the series finale, it takes a bit of pressure off of it. I'm now going in not needing this to absolutely blow the roof off in terms of a finale episode, because we know there will be at least one more shot in a couple of years. But even with that in mind, there is definitely higher expectations when it comes to these episodes. Once again, Ken Keeler takes a crack at this finale script after having written all 4 previous attempts: The Devil's Hands Are Idle Playthings, Into the Wild Green Yonder, Overclockwise, and of course Meanwhile, which stood as the actual finale for 10 years. I actually made a pretty detailed video about the 4 previous finales like 3.5 years ago, obviously before we knew the show would be returning, so maybe I'll update it when we hit that final series finale, whenever that happens. So how does it stand up? Well, I think Otherwise is a really strong episode, and it does a lot of things I really love as a potential series finale. However, I do not think it surpasses or even quite lives up to the previous series finale, Meanwhile. And honestly, that's okay. But I do think Otherwise is probably stronger than some of the other finale attempts like Into the Wild Green Yonder or Overclockwise, placing it pretty firmly in the middle of my ranking. Typically, these finales will start with a title caption that references that this might be a series finale, this one claiming we're not out of networks yet, and right off the bat, they bring in one of the funnier but smaller aspects of the show's history, Bender's sort of ongoing feud with the can opener. Bender was nearly killed by this thing first, and I second that emotion.
Stupid can opener! You killed my father, and now you've come back for me!
This obviously also states that the can opener murdered Bender's father as well, though this isn't referenced at all in otherwise. Might have been a nice touch if they had referenced this, but that's okay. And then we also see Bender actually get paralyzed by the can opener in Bendin' in the Wind, so this is an ongoing thing between the two of them. And it also makes a point to reference that Bender sings folk songs when he's magnetized.
Down in the valley!
The folk singing magnet joke was established in the second episode of the entire show, The Series Has Landed, which was also written by Ken Keeler. So pretty immediately, they are paying homage to things that have taken place across Futurama's history, all the way back to the very first season, which is a nice start. But I think what really works in this one is that they sort of treat the Planet Express ship as a surrogate for the show itself. And with the ship being destroyed, they hold a funeral and eulogize the ship, which is very clearly a way for them to eulogize the show. In classic Futurama fashion, it hits emotionally and comedically.
She saw us through lots of great adventures.
And a few mediocre ones.
Honestly, some of those 3-part adventures were kind of sloppy.
I'm not sure if when they say 3-part adventures, they're referring to the anthology episodes or the movies, but either way, I think the self-deprecating jab here is pretty fitting. There are definitely some sloppy anthologies, and a couple of those movies aren't very cohesive. The funeral allows for this really sweet sequence where the crew walks around the ship one last time to say goodbye. Christopher Ting's score here really helps with the somber mood. All around, this worked great for me, but the sci-fi aspect of this episode centers on this ship graveyard, or as the professor refers to it, the plasma sea at the bottom of the multiverse, which contains jet streams of alternate realities. Obviously, with the rise of Rick and Morty and other more popular modern media, multiverses are really trendy right now. However, Futurama was dabbling in multiverses all the way back in the Farnsworth Paradox in the original Fox run, and I think the way they're used in this finale is super effective. While paying respects to the ship, Fry starts to become overloaded with memories, even ones that haven't actually happened to him. And rather than explore a ton of alternate dimensions, they sort of play on how Fry's untethered memories motivate and change his behavior. It isn't explained explicitly in the episode, but I like to assume that the reason Fry is able to tap into all of these alternate memories over the plasma sea is probably due to his lack of a delta brainwave. But these memories are fascinating, and I think obviously the biggest takeaway from the episode for most people is going to be one of these specific images, if they caught it. We'll cover that last. But there's actually a lot of other stuff to dive into, and they get pretty creative with these alternate memories. The idea is that not all of these memories actually happened to our version of Fry. In this 10-second sequence, there are 37 shots. Most of them are just old adventures from the show's history, and I won't go over every single one. But it is worth noting that a handful of these shots were actually reanimated versions of older episodes, but most importantly, a select few of them are alternate realities. The second shot we see is the classic ending of Time Keeps on Slippin'. However, in this alternate universe, you can actually see that Leela is only spelled with one E for some reason. The fifth shot of the montage is actually the one that became the iconic "not sure if" Fry meme from The Lesser of Two Evils. However, in this version, Fry has no eyes and also features the color palette scene from the alternate Fry that we meet in the Farnsworth Paradox. The no eyes bit is actually also a reference to one of the other universes in the Farnsworth Paradox.
We didn't see anything. Ever.
However, we know this has to be a separate eyeless alternate universe because Fry's color palette is different. The seventh shot in this montage shows the shot from the bird bot of Icecatraz when Bender and Fry are arguing after Bender becomes the captain of the ship. Once again, this features the Parabox alternate color palette Fry. However, we know it can't be the universe we visited in the Farnsworth Parabox either, because in that universe, Bender is gold. So this is just firmly establishing that there are multiple realities where Fry has the black hair, green jacket color palette, and we immediately see this color palette again in the eighth shot, once again showcasing the iconic Fry squinty eye meme, but with the palette swapped Fry instead this time. This one theoretically could be in the Parabox universe that we visited, but hard to say. Next, we see Bobblehead Fry, who is also seen in the Farnsworth Parabox. This actually looks like it was the same shot and location reanimated from that episode, but only drawing Fry, not Leela and Bender's versions of themselves, and also giving Fry changing expressions, which didn't happen in the original episode. And then the 11th shot in this quick flash montage is the one everyone will be talking about if they caught it, which is of course the shot of older Fry and Leela with a purple-haired baby boy. And also Bender with ears holding Seymour, or at least a dog that looks like Seymour. We have seen Bender with ears before. He put them on in Godfellas so that he could put in earplugs to try and get some sleep, and then in Murder on the Planet Express, the shape-shifting alien accidentally kept human ears when pretending to be Bender. But I think the idea here is really just that this is an alternate Bender. Obviously, this could be seen as a huge tease for Fry and Leela's future, but with Bender having ears, I do think this is meant to hint that it isn't strictly the future for our Fry and Leela, but more so a possible outcome. Futurama has dabbled in utilizing Fry and Leela's future son before. In the 32nd issue of the comic book series, they meet Leland, which is a nightmarish combination of Fry, Leela, and Bender, who ends up being this future dictator. Really brief appearance, but this is the first time they ever explored this. Then also in the Comedy Central era, the episode Law and Oracle was actually originally meant to be an episode about a backwards time traveler who basically moved literally backwards in time, Tenet style, with the end of the episode intending to reveal that the character was Fry and Leela's son. The episode obviously shifted significantly and this never happened, though it's an idea I always wanted them to revisit. But honestly, now with such an explicit Fry and Leela child tease in the body of the show, I really hope that this is explored more in the coming 2 seasons, or maybe once again in the next series finale. It is very much just a blink and you'll miss it tease here, and it isn't really touched on further in the episode, but it feels like something that they should explore moving forward. And though the rest of this flashy memory montage is all moments from the show without any real changes, there are a couple that are kind of fascinating to consider. One of the memories we see is the simulated pixel versions of Fry and Leela from last year's season finale all the way down. So my question is, did Fry remember watching this moment of his simulated counterpart, or does he actually also have the simulation's memories flowing through him? Similarly interesting, we see a shot from The Sting that was confirmed to be a part of Leela's coma dream, which is obviously not a memory that our Fry could conceivably have. And lastly, there's a shot of Fry and Leeloo from Bender's Big Score, but that version of Fry was actually Lars, so he also seemingly has memories from his time paradox duplicate. I don't have any real theories as to what this all means, but I do think all of this is really fascinating to consider. But this is where the episode takes its big turn. Fry passes out from the memory overload, and the crew goes back into the ship to rescue him just before the ship is detonated and falls into the plasma sea. And when we return from commercial break, inexplicably, Fry has been rescued and everybody is okay. And I really loved Fry's description of his mental breakdown here.
I had some kind of attack. I started seeing flashes of things that happened, also things that didn't happen, except it felt like they did happen. Or will happen.
And this basically drives the rest of the episode. Fry is sort of haunted by these memories of things that feel real but he didn't actually experience, and for the second series finale in a row, a traumatic event leads Fry to want to propose to Leela.
So tonight at sunset, I'm meeting Leela on top of the Vampire State Building. I'm gonna ask her to marry me.
And this is where the deja vu comes in, because if that sounds familiar, it's exactly the plan he had in Meanwhile for his first proposal, an event that was wiped from his and Leela's memory because of the end of that episode, as well as the beginning of the Impossible Stream. But this time, it's playing on the fact that this is all happening again.
What's the matter?
Nothing, I just felt strange, like we'd had champagne here before.
And this all leads more explicitly to Fry having another vision overload, but this time of the events of Meanwhile. And I'm of 2 minds about this idea. On one hand, I love the way they're sort of collapsing all of these stories in on themselves. With those events having been wiped from their memory, the fact that they are still affecting the characters somehow makes it feel like it has this lasting impact, instead of just being a thing that only the audience saw and knows about. But on the other hand, while I think this is a great episode, it does sort of feel like the story itself is kind of explicitly chasing the success of Meanwhile by referencing it so overtly. I think if this had been the actual series finale, I would have maybe felt that this was a slightly unsatisfactory ending for that reason. However, I also think with the reveal at the end of the episode, it makes it sort of beautiful in a different way, which I'll get to later. Fry's phantom memories mostly lead to him wondering if he's even sane or if he's entirely losing his mind, and honestly what I love most about this aspect of the story is the simple fact that Leela confidently stands by him despite all of this insanity that he's going through.
And all I ever wanted to do is marry you. But first, I need to understand what's happening to me.
I'm not going anywhere.
The last act is primarily about the crew testing out their brand new ship, which is actually a design I really dig, but it also follows this ghost ships plot, the highlight of which is the reverb they throw on the words
Ghost ships.
Basically, there are rumors and sightings of these mysterious ghost ships, and Fry seems to think that one of them is the old Planet Express ship. I also really loved the Professor having not one but two references to a pilot episode joke.
You should see the wire I used. All the latest lengths.
These kinds of bookend jokes are, in my opinion, a really nice touch when doing these series finales. Nothing too overt, but just a nice callback from the end to the very beginning. The entire Bender is jealous of the can opener plotline also has some really fun moments, but if I had any criticism of this episode as a whole, it's that it didn't really tie into the climax in any meaningful way. It was nice to have a funny Bender subplot for the finale. The moment when he just straight up shoots the can opener is hysterical.
You think they'll try me as an adult?
But it really didn't lead to much else, and I wasn't really overly fond of the whole Bender one-hand joke. However, while Meanwhile was such a great series finale back in 2013, that episode did have a real lack of focus on any characters outside of Fry and Leela, and with Bender being such a big part of the show, I do think it's totally valid to want to make sure he gets some time to shine in a possible finale, which all culminates in what I think is a mostly pretty effective ending. The crew, as well as the Nimbus, get into a firefight with a ghost ship over the Plasma Sea, with all signs pointing towards their certain doom.
I guess this is the end again.
I don't mind dying, as long as it's with you.
I really love this line, and the fact that Fry really just laments that he and Leela never got married, which of course leads Leela to asking Zapp if he'll marry them before the end, since he's a captain. And in this beautiful moment, the pair kiss, newly married, just before the ship is destroyed. And then of course we get the reveal that for this entire episode, we were actually following an alternate Fry and Leela, and that the ghost ship they were fighting was our crew on the original Planet Express ship in their proper reality. I really enjoyed this reveal, though I do think that maybe the quick exposition dump was a tiny bit clumsy, though I don't really have an alternate pitch for how they could have executed it. It just kind of required a little bit of over-explanation as to what was going on. This scene also showcases another interesting revelation. The professor points out that out of the ship in this sequence, they were seeing numerous alternate realities and possibilities. While there were some new things showcased, like everyone worshipping a King Bender, and also the entire crew in coffins, which is maybe a reference to the fact that the show has been so close to death so many times, they also showcased scenes from some of the anthology episodes in alternate animation styles, specifically the old Disney-style animation from Reincarnation, as well as the G.I. Joe-style animation from Saturday Morning Fun Pit, basically meaning that even those anthology stories are technically canon by ways of the multiverse. They also showcased Dreamland Castle for yet another Disenchantment reference, and while the whole alternate reality aspect of this is fun to talk about, what I liked most about it was the idea that the entire crew came together and patched the ship back up to get it running again, sort of an allusion to the crew of the show returning after so many years to rebuild it. I could see some people finding the fact that a lot of this story was following a different Fry and Leela to be a little unsatisfactory, but here's why this works so well for me. Though we followed an alternate Fry and Leela for most of the episode, that Fry's actions were motivated by the memories of our Fry and Leela. The unrealized events of Meanwhile, in particular, were driving even these other versions of the characters we know and love. I think it's really nice that even across universes, somehow, these two will always find one another, even if it is just moments from their demise. One thing I've talked a lot about with my good friend Toonrific Tariq about these Futurama finales is that the best ones tend to have these great final lines. Lines that sort of have a feeling of finality while also hinting at the possibility of what's to come for the characters. The Devil's Hands Are Idle Playthings nailed this the first go-around.
Please don't stop playing, Fry. I want to hear how it ends.
And then, I think Meanwhile also delivered a comparably great final line in that same vein.
What do you say? Want to go around again?
I do.
And I think otherwise also kinda nails it in this regard. Fry draws out one of his phantom memories for Leela, which is a moment from Meanwhile, which is a nice confirmation that our Fry and Leela now have at least some recollection of those events. And then they say this.
What does it mean?
I don't know. Let's find out.
The episode ends with a cover of Warren Zevon's song Mutineer, performed by Jason Isbell and Amanda Shires, which is almost a cheat code. I find the song so emotional it makes me tear up pretty instantly. However, they actually start playing the song on the second verse instead of the first, and I think these lyrics are pretty intentionally highlighted. I was born to rock the boat, some may sink, but we will float. And given the events of this episode, I think that this kinda perfectly describes Fry. His entire existence is sort of this anomaly thanks to his lack of a delta brainwave. He's been tasked with saving the universe because of it on multiple occasions. He was born to rock the boat, one could say. And in some realities, that boat rocking works out, and in others, it ends in beautiful tragedy. Like the Fry and Leela we followed through a lot of this episode. Some may sink, but we will float. Guys, I think this was a really valiant effort as another series finale. I do not think it's as strong as Devil's Hands or Meanwhile, but I think it's stronger than Overclockwise or Into the Wild Green Yonder, and it's definitely one of the best episodes of the Hulu era. And in about 2 years, they're going to get at least one more chance to end the series on a high note. And I guess the question is, do we think they can do it?
I don't know. Let's find out.
Okay, so let's talk about this season as a whole and this year's big question. Has Futurama justified its revival quite yet? Last year I said that while I wasn't really won over by those 10 episodes, I also was optimistic about the season to come, mostly because of the pair of great episodes that they did deliver, and I think the more of these Hulu episodes that release, the more complicated the question becomes for me. Because while I'm still not sure I would say the entire revival is quite justified based on how strong the show ended in the Comedy Central era, I thought this stretch of 10 episodes was a substantial improvement over the previous 10. At least on average, it felt like the base level of quality rose, and this season contained far fewer frustrating or topical storylines than the previous. And while that last stretch had 2 of probably my least favorite episodes in Futurama history, I cannot say that about any of these 10. There were scenes I really hated, like the entire opening NFT sequence in the One Amigo, and much of the Inferno Fest Fire Fest parody, but I didn't find any episodes this year to be egregiously bad, and outside of the aforementioned NFTs and Firefest sequences, none of the topicality made me cringe. There were maybe a couple episodes that were kind of unremarkable, but nothing that upset me like last year. With that said, I also think the high points of last season might have exceeded the high points of this season, despite a general increase in quality. I Know What You Did Next Xmas and All the Way Down are probably still my favorite episodes of the Hulu era thus far, though the Temp, Otherwise, and Attack of the Clones are really not too far behind them for me. I do think there are some persistent issues across both seasons in some regards, particularly in how they've been characterizing Leela. I probably should have talked about this more in my Quids Game review, but she really feels like she's lacking much substance this year. She's mostly been used to facilitate other people's stories without having much impact herself, which is a shame. She's had that weird recurring gag in the Hulu era where she's kind of a drunk, which feels like it came out of nowhere, and she doesn't feel like she quite has that strong-willed assertiveness that she was known for in the previous eras, though I do think some criticism of how she's written is a little overblown. The gag about her ignoring the Bugalo in Beauty and the Bug was obviously meant to be a joke to make way for other characters to get a focus, but also, Leela has been shown to love to chow down on a Bugalo leg as far back as the Fox era, but I have to say, seeing so many people be really upset with this season's quality really confuses me, because I just think that nearly across the board, it feels stronger than the previous 10 episodes. It really feels like the writers are finding their groove to me. I also have to admit that because I had screeners and got my first watches in early, I was able to really take these episodes in a handful of times and sit with them. Plus, I was able to do so in different viewing environments. I actually got to watch all of them with a couple of my other friends who are huge Futurama fans, Toonrific Tariq and Nick Tendo, and being able to experience new episodes with other major fans made for a really great watch experience. Hearing what made them laugh and talking through what we did and didn't like about the episodes went a super long way, and my ranking for the season honestly shifted after each and every watch through. But I've actually always felt across every era that I find more to like the more I watch most episodes of the show, and the Hulu era has mostly been no different. I also think one negative that people aren't talking about as much in this era is the show honestly just does not look quite as good as it used to. Obviously the general animation looks the same, but sequences aren't nearly as dynamic as they were in the movie or Comedy Central era, and when you look at some of that stuff side by side, it's pretty clear. Of course, this really has nothing to do with talent or effort as much as it does budget and production scheduling, so we get what we get, and it doesn't look bad. Looking back on these first 2 Hulu seasons, I cannot say that the show has entirely justified nullifying the great ending that was Meanwhile, but I also cannot say that I am upset that the show has returned. I have had a ton of fun watching, analyzing, and talking about these episodes over the past year or so, even if I have some misgivings about some of the episodes and how they're treating certain characters. They have have still delivered a handful of stories that I'm really glad exist in the Futurama canon. Ultimately, I just really need the show to deliver an amazing series finale when it finally does end again for good. Whether that's 20 episodes from now after this renewal is finished, in potential episodes beyond that if it's renewed again, or in that possible big budget theatrical movie that the crew wants to make and that I keep dreaming of. And though I didn't think Otherwise was as strong as Meanwhile or Devil's Hands, it sounds like they did change some of its ending knowing that they had been renewed for another 20 episodes, and I am still pretty confident that the ultimate finale will stick the landing. If anyone can do that 6 times, it is Futurama. Alright folks, that's all I got for you. See you next year in the world of tomorrow!
I stay mellow watching Johnny Two Cellos. He talks cartoons, he's a really cool fellow. He keeps you posted on adult cartoons. If that's what you're into, then grab a spoon and a very big bowl of your favorite cereal. Feels like Saturday morning cartoon material. Johnny Two Cellos, watch him on YouTube. Now enjoy this groove and bust a move.